welcome to Economic Lifelines Nigeria. I'm Keisha Gitari. In today's program, we unpack Nigeria's power sector reforms and find out how the privatization of the industry is helping to light up the country and grow the economy. Despite being Africa's top energy producer with the world's 7th largest gas reserves, Nigeria generates and distributes only enough electricity for a few hours a day. And despite efforts to improve the sector, many areas remain in the dark. The power sector's last notable investment was made in 1990 with the building of the Shiroro Power Station, a hydro plant situated on the Kaduna River. At the time, Nigeria had a population of over 100 million people. Generation was at an all-time low of approximately 2,000 megawatts, and the deficit in the power sector was already telling on socio-economic life.
Industries were closing down. Life was miserable and something needed to be done. And it was the era of reform, and it actually started from about 2000 when the policy was put in place. And then in 2005, the Electric Power Sector Reform Act was also passed. And that actually, constituted the turning point for this sector, because once the law was in place to back up all the reform that needed to be done, things began to move. And I think the most important thing about that law was the fact that it changed NEPA from a monopoly and unbundled the sector, and then further unbundled into 11 distribution companies, 6 generation companies, and a transmission company. The whole idea being to start a market-based system with the electric power sector.
The need to reform our power sector was underpinned by certain realities. First is that we have a huge population that need electricity, and the gap between supply and demand was widening by the day, literally speaking. Secondly, as you know, everywhere in the world, electricity unlocks the economy. So whilst we could be suffering at household level just to have electricity in our homes, our industries, our economic base was whittling down, was being destroyed and devastated again by the minute. We had companies that had relocated after several years of being frustrated, generating their own power and producing goods at very uncompetitive prices, and not even being able to export to neighboring West African countries. So it was, if you ask me, the major source of threat to our continued progress as an economy. In spite of the fact that we had oil, we couldn't just become a dominant or even a regular economy that is respectable, simply because we had no oil, we had no light.
In a bid to regain stability in the sector, several reforms were drafted. But the reality of putting these in place proved a challenge. Nigeria's federal government struggled to attract investors into the sector.
Aside from the fact that government was not investing, it could also not attract investment into the sector for many reasons. And I think one of the major reasons was the fact that the tariff was not cost reflective. And also, loss levels were very low, and there was no confidence. If a generating company wanted to come to Nigeria to generate power, it would be requiring the government to give it guarantees, sovereign guarantees, which the government wasn't willing to do. So there was need for what you call a credible off-taker for the power that was going to be produced. And that was why the reform was very critical in terms of ensuring that tariff was cost reflective, and that the distribution companies were reformed, privatized, so that they could be in the hands of people who would be able to collect, because losses were in the region of about 50%. They were making 50% losses. Aggregate technical, commercial losses and collection losses were about 50%. So you needed distribution in the hands of the private sector so that they could collect sufficiently, invest in distribution, and that would give the generating companies the confidence to come and generate, and therefore be sure that they would be paid for the power that they generated.
To alleviate investors' concerns, it became clear that the power sector needed to be de-risked, and this was to be done through a process of privatization.
Privatization obviously is attracting investment and management skills to the sector. That's what we needed to do. I explained about distribution, the losses that were being made, because for the distribution companies, for them to bid, the bidding parameters were that they would have to have the managerial ability and then investment capacity to actually bring down the losses from the 50% down to a level that would ensure that the sector would become more viable. And that obviously means that they would have to be able to collect and pay the generation companies. So that was there. The things that enabled us to get to privatization were that we were able to de-risk the sector, take away all those fears that the investors had about the sector, give them assurances about transmission by bringing in the management contractor. And a lot has been done. You'll be surprised, because it's important that you actually move from where you are. Even if there are challenges, you have to keep moving. And that's essentially what we did, because a lot of the investment that was required for transmission has now been made. So the transmission system is improving. The software that is required to take us to market trading is also being put in place. So that's a milestone. NERC is, they're going to keep an eye on the sector. They're there. The investors were able to raise financing from the local banks. So, we're making progress. It's gradual, but it's sure. And, that's really what is exciting.
When you talk about power reform, what are you trying to achieve in practical terms? First, you are shifting the market from government ownership and operation to market mode, to private sector mode, so that the forces of demand, supply, cost, and profit and revenue will be at play. You are also designing a more efficient power production model where people develop power projects, be it at the generation, at the gas, at the hydro, at the coal, at the transmission, at the household distribution level. Each of those areas become commercially viable and properly incentivized market systems. The reform is just to create a dynamic system in which government plays its role as a policy enabler for market progress in the market, and then plugs in their investment in areas where they have expertise and where their business interests coincide. And then the consumer is the target of all of it. He just keeps getting a better level of service on the back of his commitment to pay. And then all of that just grows a power market where we should not be so far away.
The greatest problem that most power companies have today is that the general public, and a lot of the general public who are asking on the one hand for steady power, a lot of them are also somewhat responsible for some of the demise you have. So you would find them still tapping illegally from power lines. You will see there's a huge amount of meter tampering that still goes on. You would find out that the general public is still trying to connive and coerce officials of power companies to slash their bills, do all sorts of things. So until we come to an understanding that both sides have to act as partners in this, you still have that challenge, and that's basically where it is. You've had a long history of abuse on both sides of the fence, and now we really have to sit down and have a serious in-depth discussion between customer and client to say, you know what, if we really want to move this forward, then the greatest policing that we can do is not the power companies or the distribution companies going out there and policing, but each person neighbor to neighbor policing their neighbor. In strategy sessions, we often we often have this discussion where you ask just a rhetorical question. If you see your neighbor come up and say that he's found a way to slash his bill by half through either bypassing a meter one phase, or somebody in the system is able to negotiate his bill for him and he doesn't have to pay what he's consuming, what would you do? What's the first thing that you think that the neighbor would do? And most people would agree with you almost immediately that they'll say, connect me to that person who has done it for me.
The recent takeover of the power holding company of Nigeria, PHCN, by private operators such as Transcorp and the Sahara Energy Group has led to mixed reactions. The government feels that the sector is now set to thrive in the hands of the private sector. But for consumers and industry, the fear is that privatization will lead to a fresh round of tariff hikes that they cannot afford. For many of the new operators, the decision to invest in the ailing power sector was a bold one.
We saw opportunity to make impact, we saw opportunity to make money, we saw opportunity to solve a problem, and we also looked at our strengths. Transcorp is about investing in new sectors, it's about turning around ailing businesses, it's about creating new businesses that would help sectors to open up. So when you put all of that together, the challenges that the power sector had in the past years presented for Transcorp a huge opportunity. And our investment model also was such that we always partner with some of the best international operators in different sectors. In hospitality, for example, where we have partnered with Hilton for over 26 years to run Nigeria's best hotel. So for us, it was really a no-brainer to get into the power sector. And having taken over the Ughelli power plants in November of last year, the model that we had in mind when we made our investment is beginning to show and pay off immediately. We took over at 160 megawatts. Today we are generating about 370 megawatts. And you're right, we have very lofty ambitions for that sector. Because the demand for power in Nigeria is huge. Nigeria is estimated to be needing up to 40,000 megawatts of power. And even with what we're doing and with what other investors in the power sector are doing, we're still producing less than 5,000 megawatts. So there's a huge opportunity for growth.
While some people look at issues like poor performance and run away from it, we look at issues as poor performance as opportunities, because what that means is that you have a vast area where you can improve, and that's what Nigeria's sector actually does for you. Huge opportunities.
For decades, the decline in Nigeria's power sector has meant that the nation's most prominent source of power came from generators like these. Homes and businesses had been turned into DIY power generators using imported diesel. Now, after the break, we uncover just how impactful the power sector reforms have been in changing this. Welcome back to Economic Lifelines Nigeria. Nigeria's federal government has identified job creation as a key thrust for its 2014 budget, and the adequate supply of electricity is a key enabler to achieving this goal. Earlier in the program, we looked at how the decline of the power sector had led to the halt of socio-economic developments. Now let's uncover how privatization is reviving industries and improving employment figures. According to the World Bank, Nigeria is ranked 122nd and 147th out of 189 countries assessed in terms of their suitability to accommodate and sustain entrepreneurship. The benchmark for this study was power efficiency. And despite now being Africa's largest economy, Nigeria is still falling short in this regard. The greatest consequence of inadequate power generation is that it directly cripples industries, resulting in job losses.
First of all, understand that Nigeria as a country has actually privatized power for the last 30 years. Most people have their own small independent power from generators and all of that, but that's on a lighter note. So we have actually been running our own mini power stations for God knows how long. And even that, notwithstanding, what you've seen is you've seen businesses survive, you've seen factories still spring up, you've seen an economy still grow in spite of not having regular public power. So now can you imagine what would happen once the private sector then comes in to run that and operate that efficiently?
You look at what the reform is doing, opening up the market to private companies. And these private companies, for instance, if you think of the PACN's, liability, not liability, but assets that were eventually offloaded by the government and bought, generation companies, distribution companies, you see that these new companies have already started expanding. Some of them have contracted to double their capacity. And what is that going to do? There'll be job creation. There'll be much more power supply to the people. Small and medium scale enterprises will grow. Industries will stabilize and make more profit. The more profit they make, the more investment they do. The more investment they do, the more jobs are created. The more jobs are created, poverty goes down. And as poverty goes down, the wealth base of the people will increase rapidly. So it is going to have a great exponential benefit to the people generally.
What power does for an economy is that it literally empowers the people, allowing small businesses to thrive, to be able to compete, allowing big businesses also to thrive. We find that Nigerian goods are not competitive in many instances because the cost of the factories is not the same with the international competitors. And this is one of the reasons for this has been reduced to how much Nigerian manufacturing spends on power. A lot of companies have to buy their own generators, and diesel is not cheap, and all of that. So the employment potentials of an improved power sector in Nigeria is really massive. The power plants and the distribution companies would increase the number of people they employ. But that is completely insignificant when you compare that to the multiplier effect of other sectors being more efficient. The agricultural sector needs to improve, go from just growing crops to food processing. Food processing in Nigeria is not very profitable because of the power situation when you have to now generate your own power. So if we have stable and adequate power, and that becomes a lot more competitive, it could employ a huge number of people. So I think that the power sector development is the key to unlocking that challenge that unemployment has been causing in the country.
Reforms in the power sector are also aiming at boosting indigenous power generation companies, some of which are in need of significant help. By shining a light on the sector, the reforms have allowed other institutions to get involved. The Asset Management Corporation of Nigeria, AMCON, is one such body. By helping to alleviate the debt of banks funding various sectors of the economy, including power, AMCON has helped to allow these industries to receive the vital funding they need.
AMCON would take debt, sometimes bad debt and good debt. For example, in our case, the bank, one of the banks that financed us, has heavy load of debt, and so needed to be. They needed to keep the bank light. It is somewhat a duty of the central bank and AMCON to ensure that all the banks are able to perform, so that they are light, and which means that in terms of liquidity, that they are liquid enough, that their money is not all tied somewhere. So in projects that have long gestation period, like power, it's possible for, at some point, for AMCON to say, okay, we would take some of your debt, maybe not all of it, some of your debt to lighten you up, and the debt will have to be performing debt. and go on. This is the case in this particular project. It's a performing debt, and which AMCON has taken. So AMCON actually has a very important role that it plays in, particularly in infrastructure industry, that it's able to use government muscle to support banks, to continue to support industries, not just power, but any industry. It's a very, very positive role that they play.
The power reforms in Nigeria are certainly bringing about a notable shift in the industry. The successful completion of the first phase at the end of 2013, funded by a significant number of indigenous financial institutions, led to a smooth transition into phase 2. And there is a strong belief from the government that international investors will be keener to join in. However, with local funding bodies already heavily invested, some analysts feel there is now need for international institutions to step in, while others have reservations.
When you talk generally about investment in the power sector, it is quite huge. There are companies that are coming on with billions of US dollars. GE is doing that. Other companies are coming with that. Power China said that they are ready to infuse as much as 12 billion US dollars by owning equity in a 20,000 megawatts power facility in Nigeria. So we have a lot that is coming in, and we encourage that.
I think some of the issues that international banks are going to face with this round of privatization is things like, the bankability of these deals. Are they structured well enough to allow them to come in? And my feeling is that I don't think they are, talking to some of the banks, international banks that we work with, I don't think we're quite there yet. I think we're along the road. We're a lot further along the road compared to where the Nigeria power sector was before. But I think there needs to be some changes to be made. I think that the international banks are really worrying about is, at the end of the day, the person who's buying the electricity is the National Bulk Electricity Company, NBED. Now, NBED is a new company that's been created. It has been capitalized. And I think the capitalization, people are talking about between 500 million and $1 billion. But these assets are, as you said, between $4 and $5 billion. So what happens if NBED cannot pay? Right? Who's going to step in and actually make the payment? So look, lenders, all international banks, or any lenders, at the end of the day, they're worrying about what happens if you can't pay. Right? And usually what happens is that there's either a federal government guarantee or a sovereign government guarantee or some sort of credit enhancement that's put in place to back the company that's actually providing the obligation to pay. And we're not quite here yet in Nigeria. There was talk about a World Bank partial risk guarantee. There was talk about MIGA, which is another part of World Bank, providing political risk guarantee. But again, that's still work in progress. So I think we're still not quite there in terms of international banks coming in. I think they're watching it with interest because, as you know, it is the biggest privatization in the world that's happening at the moment. But there's some work to be done.
The roadmap for Nigeria's power sector revolution is clearly outlined, and for the moment it appears to be on track. It is hoped that with the private sector at the helm of the industry, it will finally be revived. And that's where we leave it for Economic Lifelines Nigeria. Remember, this and past editions of the program are available on our website at www.cnbcafrica.com. So from me, Keisha Gitari, until next time, goodbye.